Welcome everyone to this Hunter Living History Showcase for July 1st, 2024. I'd like to welcome you all here today, and I'd also like to acknowledge and respect the Aboriginal people on whose land we're meeting here today at the University of Newcastle, which is the Aboriginal people, and I'd like to extend my respect and acknowledgements to the Aboriginal people who the lands upon whose I'm feeling like I'm having a Joe Biden moment. But please don't judge me. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and lands upon which you're beaming into us from across the valley. And pay my respects to elders both past, present and those emerging. So, okay, today is we're having a discussion and with some wonderful presenters here, which hopefully will be able to give us a lovely overview of the housing and planning issue that seems to be agitating a lot of people across heritage and environmental groups. And we've also got just to start, we've got a bit of a presentation on an exhibition that's just been set up downstairs. They've put the finishing touches on just this morning, and that's Rewind. So I'll hand over to Dr. Anne Hardy, who's been part of the team putting that together.
Yes, so the exhibition is called Rewind, a Hunter Region Television Retrospective. As many of you know, the Ambient Television Archive is still in process of being digitised in the GlamX lab. What has been digitised is the magnetic tape. This exhibition features some of the photographs, historic photographs that are part of the Ambient Television Archive. And the retrospective sort of looks at mainly the 1960s and 70s because it sort of seems to be like the true essence of television, starting on film and then that transition slowly to magnetic tape. So we're going to have a soft launch after this meeting at 2:30. So anyone who's got a bit of time and wants to pop down for some afternoon tea. So the exhibition features some of the artefacts and different formats, magnetic tape, film, and we've had the generosity of some of the ex-MBNers who have helped identify photographs and also loaned from private collections, cameras, and other memorabilia. So we're sort of capturing as much as we can that people can recall from that era in terms of who people are in photographs and things like that. So thank you to Katie Centers, Dr. Katie Centers, who's our colleague in Special Collections, who helped put the exhibition together, and also our Vera Deakin Regional History Fund intern, Reese Burke, selected and curated the artefacts. So that will be on till late August. We also hope to have a bit of the footage on display downstairs, and we're going to 3D scan the exhibition as well, so it'll be available online to share. So yeah, you're all welcome after the meeting.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Yes, it looks beautiful down there, and there's lots of photographs of very famous Australian actors that you can also have a look at. They're fascinating to see. All right, fantastic. Okay, so next, this is what we're here to do. It's basically a topic discussion because late last year we had a number of heritage and environmental groups expressing concern about the housing issue. So, I mean, obviously we're in the middle of a housing crisis and everyone wants something done to get people into affordable housing, but are worried that the mad rush is trashing planning. They simply fear that replacing poor planning that got us into the housing mess is not going to be solved by more poor planning rush to get us out of it. So we thought to ourselves, well, look, we've got these themes coming through, so it'd be great if we could pull together some expertise from across the ages and across the demographics. So We found three presenters today, and we're very, very happy with these three presenters. So the first I see has just illuminated up on Zoom, which is fantastic, and that's Mr. Joe Flood. Now, Joe was a principal research scientist and leader of housing research at the CSIRO. So he is a policy data analyst and mathematician. He's made contributions to mathematics, housing and urban economics, urban indicators, slum studies, climate change and genetic genealogy. So he worked at the CSIRO from 1977 to 1993, where he conducted about 25 research projects into every level of government in Australia during 1984 to 1983. His research contributed to several major changes in Australia's housing policy. So we're very interested because the question that we're asking our panellists is basically trying to understand how public and affordable housing once worked, why it went belly up, and what we need to do to get it back on track. So Joe's going to be our first speaker, and he'll be giving us an overview of that whole thing. Our next speaker will be an architecture student and business, Enzhuo Gai, or Jason, as he knows, similar to me in terms of anglicised name. He's an architecture graduate from the University of Newcastle. He founded his design studio, a boutique design firm with 14 years of industry experience. Jason successfully leads and completes a wide range of projects from residential to commercial, such as residential homes, medium density housing, childcare centres, mixed-use commercials, town centre design and planning projects. So he's been working with a couple of our heritage guys here, Shane Blatchford and Paul. What's Paul's last name? That's it, Paul Battle. He's the most peaceful guy you've ever met. So Paul, I mean, again, this was part of the Broadmeadow project where we're trying to grapple with these issues of heritage, environmental, and there's been a bit of argy-bargy with the state government and local government. And, so it's great to have the useful point of view in terms of how do we approach these projects free from ideological and political sort of torture and for the best plan. And our third speaker is Dr. John Mackenzie, who's a consultant at the Institute for Regional Futures. So John is a consulting researcher at the University of Newcastle Institute for Regional Futures, one of the university's flagship regional institutes. Building on the legacy of the Hunter Research Foundation, the Institute partners with government, industries and commercial communities, providing social, economic and spatial evidence to strategic planning and decision making. So John chairs the City of Newcastle's Liveable Cities Committee and is a member of the Hunter Central Coast Regional Planning Panel, both of which inform key decisions in planning and housing in the City of Newcastle. So between these three speakers, we should have a great overview of the past and wisdom in terms of how things used to work, youthful exuberance in terms of what we do right now in terms of how the university playing into these problems, and then we've got a sort of real-world example of what we're doing, or what the realities of it that we're being confronted with.
I think I'm bringing the ideological torture.
Okay, so if you have a look at the site, I've created three images out of Google Gemini AI to describe each of the speakers' visual representations, if you want to have a look at them. Otherwise, Joe, are you ready to go?
Now, hello, everybody. That's all right. All right, I'm not exactly going to talk about public housing. It's one of the things I do, but it's only part of what I do, which is much more about housing crises. And I don't think anyone will object if I talk about housing crises today, because that's what we're here for. Just to add a little more to what Johnny already said, I finished in CSIRO about 1993. We set up AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. I was head of housing there and deputy for a while. I then got a job in the United Nations, UN Habitat, looking at housing around the world essentially and how it worked and when it didn't work. And for about 15 years I did that, going to various countries, helping them to collect data, helping them to work out if their system was working or not and what they needed. It's kind of strange coming back to my own country and seeing exactly how bad it is compared with everybody else. But anyway, let's get on with it. there's kind of two different philosophies for housing intervention. There's the one that housing is just a commodity. We're going to provide assistance for those who can't afford it, and the market will look after the rest. Lovely theory, doesn't work. The other version is the World Bank works with, and so do I. Every part affects the rest. You can't just patch it up at the edges. You're just putting a Band-Aid over a cancer. Piecemeal solutions may make things worse. Okay. Let's go right back to the housing crisis of 1950, which was somewhat worse than we've got now. It was after the war. Nobody had any housing. Here's this stupid thing would stop coming up. Here's Homes for Heroes and Homebush in 1950. Now, the fellows that planned our housing system actually knew what they were doing, which is amazing. The Commonwealth Housing Commission 1944, if only we'd had them now. They claimed the private sector repeatedly failed to be adequate housing for the low-income groups in Australia. Government should accept responsibility for doing so. They were scornful of the way private landlords had historically treated renters. Housing was a right. It should stop being a field of investment that yielded high profits for a minority of landowners. Rent should be no more than 1/6 of a family's income, if only. They wanted the erection of at least 700,000 dwellings by the end of 1955, and they might need a whole lot of tradesmen. So they should have immigration policies and be bringing more building labour. Much of that actually happened. These fellows knew what they were doing. And it sounds awfully familiar now because virtually what people are asking for. How many years later is it now? 90? No, 80. 80 years later. They said, we consider a dwelling of good standard and equipment is not only the need but the right of every citizen, whether the dwelling is to be rented or purchased. No tenant or purchase should be exploited for excessive profit. Lovely idea. But when they looked at it, they decided other people were busy building public housing like crazy all over Europe. And they said, well, let's look at the costs here. The ones that are paying least are the owners with no mortgage. So if we get everyone into home ownership, or as many as we can, they'll end up paying a lot less than even social or public renters. So we'll do that, and we'll put up some public housing, but not very much. And they did put up some public housing, like about 4%, which was just pathetic next to what everybody else did. They were having 20 and 30% public housing. In the meantime, the ones that suffer the most, as always, are the private renters, who are paying a very large proportion of their income on housing. And I know all about it, having been a renter for the last 10 years. So the market didn't exactly do a great job, as everyone had hoped. Back in 1950, away went home ownership. It was about 55%. It went straight up to 70% in only about 10 years. It was a pretty incredible performance. By the time it got up to the top, which is when I entered the market, you needed 2 incomes, but at the start, as my father was fond of telling me, you only needed 1 income to buy a house. But still, you could get into them, even though interest rates suddenly became absolutely prohibitive at 12% plus. This is us starting out building a house and in open fields, as you were. We've got a little 12 square thing, box, and on quite a big piece of land at that time. And you did your best to pay for it, usually with a couple of mortgages and borrowing the deposit in our case, which was extreme, but we did it. However, as late as 1996, the market was looking more or less okay, but by 2004 it was looking very bad, and that's when I got nervous about it. The policy mistakes that were made along the way, quite a bit. We started up with the Henderson Commission in 1977, which said, okay, we don't want people with regular incomes in public housing. We don't have enough of it. We're going to get rid of them all and put only very poor people in there. Lovely idea, except the very poor people couldn't afford to pay for the public housing, not even the basic costs of public housing, like repairs and administration. Even today, public housing makes about a 50% loss, and that's why nobody wants it, because who wants to take on an albatross around their neck that's going to make a 50% loss? There's ways out of it, but nobody's ever bothered to take the trouble to fix it. This thing will stop. Anyway, so that was the Henderson Commission. Ever since then, public housing has not worked. There's never been enough money to pay for public housing. There's been nobody paying for it. The state governments had to use more and more of their income to pump it up. There was nothing left over to build houses or even to clean it, to fix up the ones they had. The Feds closed the Department of Housing in 1988. We must have been about the only country in the world that didn't have a Department of Housing. And after that, it was anything goes because everything was totally divided. It was sucked into the Department of Social Security, and from then on, it was Social Security and not housing. So there was no construction involved in it. It's a continuing responsible to accept responsibility, the Commonwealth versus the states. And this I've had to put up with ever since, watching the Commonwealth and the states brawl it out, none of them wanting to take responsibility. The Commonwealth says it's a state responsibility. The states say we can't pay for it. You've got to pay for it, and neither of them have done anything. Nothing has happened in that entire time. Settlement and immigration policy has been siloed from housing. So it's not taken into account at all when we do our housing policy, not that we have a housing policy anymore. And especially the good old Reserve Bank have responsibility to keep housing markets under control at all. It's all about keeping wages down, basically, if you really look at what it's doing. This is not a very good graph, but I've grabbed it quickly. We in the UN, when I was working there, and we used to say that the house price to income should be about 3. You've probably heard these numbers somewhere along the track. So back here, even in 97, it was about 3. It was okay. It was running along quite well. But then it started to roar off like crazy up until, well, it finally broke at the time of the GST. But it was shored up yet again and didn't really go down much. And away it went roaring when the Reserve Bank decided to rescue things by putting interest rates down to almost 0. Very low interest rates, very high immigration. We've got money laundering going on from overseas. The population was living longer and staying in its places, in its houses longer. And there were very easy arrangement for landlord capital gains, which is something that everybody hits on immediately, but all these other things are just about as bad. In the case of home ownership, well, the price, it's continued to go up and up, this price to income ratio. Time to save for a house deposit now running at about 10 years for the average person. It's all pretty grim, you know. I've met so many young people who say we can't possibly, you know, we think we're going to get to save a deposit and then we can't. A deposit is a lot of money now. You've got to save 10%, 20%, for instance, of a $900,000 house. That's $180,000 you've got to come up with. Where are you going to get that apart from the bank of mum and dad? And they're going to be struggling too. So we're hitting a situation where home ownership is dropping fast. 1 in 5 Australians are renting in retirement. 30% expect they'll still be paying down their mortgage after working. The portion of 30 to 34-year-olds that own their homes has fallen from 65 to just 50%. I think we're heading towards the good old pre-war system where 50% of people were homeowners, and yet we've done absolutely nothing to work on what that's going to mean for the country. Affordable housing. Let's talk about public housing a bit. In 1977, as waiting lists lengthened, public housing was reserved only for the very poor. Unfortunately, their income was not enough to pay for the admin and repairs, as I said already. It was losing money. State governments didn't want it. Also, because the percentage was so low, like about 4% compared with, say, 20 or 25% elsewhere, almost all new tenants needed support services. They were people that were severely disadvantaged, say mental illness, they were prisoners, they were people that had all sorts of problems. Only community housing has been able to supply that, and they've taken on much of the brunt of that, even though they're not very big yet. Community housing also gets rent assistance, which has lent them balanced budgets. That's been one of the big bugbears. Public housing does not get rent assistance. So it actually saves money for the Commonwealth to put people in public housing because they don't have to pay rent assistance to them, which is a lot of money. Public housing sat within DSS. The community sector was interested, and by that I mean the people who were responsible for putting people in public housing were interested mostly in services, not houses. I've had to work with these people, and only a small minority are actually interested in housing. Construction can't keep pace with the immigration. Why would you bring so many people in if you haven't got the houses from? Building activity has just been sliding, and it's gotten even worse after COVID. There's very little, the amount of starts is puny compared with what we need. Public housing has been sliding as a percentage. We had a little rise in community housing, but even so, we're now below 4%, still going down. As the population is going up and the public housing is not going up. We've got a chronic, not just in public housing, but across rental housing, we've got a chronic shortage, especially at the bottom end. Builders don't want to build lower end houses, even though that's where the shortage is. Profits are too low and single landlords aren't interested. Our rental vacancy rates in Australia are like 1 to 3%. In the USA, they have something like 9 to 11% vacancy rates. That means there's a lot of housing sitting there waiting for people to occupy them, and landlords are prepared to cut deals to put poor people in. Everyone thinks the USA's housing is terrible. Compared with Australia, it's terrific at the moment. Okay, let's see what's going wrong at the present. After 2010, the Reserve Bank drove interest rates down to zero. House prices went through the roof and so did debt. Increasingly higher income housing were pushed into rental. They couldn't get into home ownership anymore. They were taking up a big slab of the rental housing. They were pushing out the people from there. In terms of housing affordability ratings, well, we can forget about Hong Kong, but after that, we're the worst. Nearly 10 times. It's a ratio of median house prices to median income. We're up near 10. It's supposed to be 3, remember? Quite a few countries are still not bad. Even the US is it's running at 5. It's still not great, but it's certainly a lot better than Australia, where housing is twice as expensive as the US. And this is a country that's just, we have more arable land per person than any other country in the world. We've got great open plains out there, and for some reason we packed them all into tiny little areas. Anyway, let's go to Newcastle. I've gone and scrubbed up a little bit of data for that, as that's what we're talking about. Median house price of units in Newcastle is now 917,000. Wow, that's the way the trend's been going. Median house rental is about 650, unit about 600. It's a very high percentage of the income of lower income people. It wasn't just affordability. We had a problem with safety and security. It's one of the big things we've had to deal with internationally, that people in slums get pushed out of their homes. In Australia, they get pushed out of their homes without anyone even talking about it. Lots of them. I know, because I was renting for 10 years and I got pushed out 5 times. Landlords start cashing in on their huge capital gains. People with children and old people forced to move every year. It was about every 1 or 2 years I was forced to move. I worked in about 2018 for Community Housing Limited, which is the biggest community housing body in the country. In New South Wales, got housing up at Kempsey and other places. Around Newcastle, you've got different community housing people. We did a study in which we found out that they were quoting that their main problem was lack of security. They didn't care about the affordability. They had no home. People with disabilities get affected very badly. I have a son with schizophrenia, and for him to be living with no security is just impossible for him. He's got no chance of getting better. Fortunately, he got himself into public housing very early. People with disabilities tend to be affected the most by being moved around, but so are people with families. And I'm seeing, as I rented, I saw more and more families moving into the rental housing around me, a lot. Something like half, none at the start. 5 years later, half the rental housing had children in them. Post-COVID, well, now we've got a market in terrible imbalance, and now we're going to really shake it up. Labour and supply shortages started kicking in. Reserve Bank raises interest rates to stop wage hikes. Landlords had to start raising rents, and the pain began. We'll just also put up a couple of properties to give you an idea what you can get in Newcastle. Now this looks nice in Hunter Street. We could get that one, except at $1,600 per week rent. Looks okay. Also in Hunter Street, you can get this one. This is student accommodation, no toilet or kitchen, $250 a week. If I was in it, that would take 42% of my pension just to live there. So that's what I could get living on my own. Maybe, and it still will be taking a massive slab on my pension. The pressure has been on vacancy rates big time as we've run out of houses. It's going down and down and down and down. It went down to about the lowest it's ever been in about November 23. What that means is if it's down about 1%, you've got 80 to 100 people lining up for any house at all. I know because I did it in Victoria at some of the worst times. I was at one. It was a one-bedroom flat up on the 3rd floor. People were queuing the entire way down the 3 floors and right out into the street just to look at it. When you put in for it, you don't get them. You've really got to know somebody. You've got to talk somebody into it somehow before you can even get one. I was always able to get one, but it took a lot of work. And it takes up months of your time every time you're throwing out because the landlords want to get their money. Anyway. Anglicare survey in Newcastle. Might as well talk a bit about homelessness in Newcastle, or unaffordability in Newcastle. Of 1,750 rental listings across the area, they could only find 16 that were affordable for a single person on low wages. 7 for a person on the pension and 0 for people on parenting payment or job seeker. People on Centrelink payments are being pushed out of housing altogether, the survey said. Fixing it. What are they doing to fix it? Yes, they're trying to do something at last, but mostly because the renters are really squealing at last. It's been broken for 30 years and no one did anything. Okay, this is what the Housing Accord is finally going to do after all that time. They're going to build 1.2 million new houses by 2029. Oh yes, I'll believe it when I see it. We build about 120,000 a year at the moment. 350 million was given to support the delivery of 10,000 affordable homes, whatever that means. The state and territory governments were supposed to match it, as they always are. They probably will. The Housing Australian Future Fund, which was another trick of the federal government, has about 10 billion to support the construction of up to 40,000 social affordable homes. That'll help a bit, but it doesn't go anywhere near meeting what's really required. They just made a number of new commitments in the last budget, another $1 billion to spend on help state and territory governments build enabling infrastructure for new housing. Well, that's something nice. Not only don't we have the houses, we don't have any infrastructure for the houses, and yet we're going to bring in thousands and thousands of the biggest number of immigrants anyone's ever heard of. I have nothing whatsoever against immigrants. It's made our country great, but they've got to have somewhere to live and they've got to have some infrastructure. A couple of billion to increase the maximum rates of Commonwealth rent assistance. Commonwealth rent assistance is something close to my heart because I helped to set it up back in 1988. So that does help in the public sector in the private sector to alleviate rent assistance. It doesn't help in public housing because they don't get it. Free TAFE places in construction. A couple of billion in concessional loans to community housing providers and other charities for new social and affordable homes. That'll help. As I said, I worked in community housing for a couple of years there, and I'm always happy to see them able to push ahead. They've been able to get very little extra housing in this country for a very, very long time now. Something that's got some hope. Allow foreign investors to buy into build-to-rent developments with a lower foreign investment fee. I think build-to-rent could actually, it's working quite well in the United States. Whether it'll work here is yet to be seen, but it's something to do. Basically, you build the houses and it's intended to be rented and you don't boot people out. They have long leases.
That's the solution.
And they're usually biggish setups, and it's all private sector. But it seems to work. The USA's got away with all sorts of stuff you wouldn't think it'd work. Could well work here. $423 million in funding to the National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness never goes amiss. There are many people who need services, who need assistance to get rapidly away from situations which are completely unacceptable to them and everybody else. And that's it. I've done it pretty quickly to give a rather gloomy examination of what's been going on. And I'm sure that we can discuss it more. Okay?
Great. Thank you very much, Chair. Excellent. Okay, so thank you for that massive overview and that homework. And we really appreciate that you were up for most of the night doing it, Joe. So thank you very much for your commitment to it. Okay, Jason.
Thank you.
So stay tuned. We'll get to a discussion soon. But, you're up.
Okay. Just say thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today, and thanks for the invitation. So this is a sketch, and so we, as I said, we try to sort of look at the finding out the potential of our city. So, and to fund and make it sort of a Newcastle City a nice environment to live in, and to discover the potential. So we have to look back in the past. This is Newcastle in 1814. It's the original character with original people and culture, and we have sort of diversified forests throughout. Newcastle 1874, the city start taking shape, but however at the cost of the environment. This fast forward to 1929, the impact stretched far beyond the outer suburbs, and you can see some little forest left, and there's a clear deforestation cut line in the distance. Now this is Newcastle today, and perhaps there's no forest left in the city, and whatever left in the distance is fragmented. Here's a few facts. So in the past 200 years, we have lost about 50% of our forest and habitat. And in the last 20 years alone, in Newcastle, we have lost 14%. So this is the current threatened species in our region. And if we lost them, it's very hard to get them back. So the question I have is, can we bring native forests back into our city? And can planning find a way so our neighborhood can coexist with ecosystem? So I have a big idea to show you, but before I do that, I did some research around the community, and I can see there's an outcry for something better. And what I'm about proposing to you may have a community support. So this is the big idea. So the Newcastle have two creek system running through the city. So there's Sticks Creek and Cottage Creek. The idea is to restore the creek system to its natural characteristic, increase capacity, and also building the wildlife corridors along the river system, connecting the ecosystem from the mountains to the river. And from that, we can expand the ecosystem to the city, branch it out from this central eco corridor. While we're doing that, the city can still grow with the ecosystem by we can build a high density neighborhood along the main transport lines to support future growth. So now we look, zoom into the particular site. This is the site that Bromeadow Round Table is. It's kind of like in the center, very central located. You notice around the site there is a big high ground, which will funnel all the water through the site. So this site actually is it's a gateway to the city. So managing this flood problem is very important for the whole city. So zoom into the site. This is the site. It's contaminated. So the yellow bit is showing the area is contaminated, and it's also flooded. So this is a PM peak maximum floodway through the site, and they also have heritage items. Very difficult site for development. So my proposal is reinstate the natural waterways, which will cope with maximum peak flood. So this way the site won't be flooded anymore. And then there are also a lot of green spaces where we can have opportunity to install like attraction items. For example, Aboriginal cultural significant parks, or maybe relate to the heritage of Newcastle with the trains and industrial heritage. So become attractive to the community to come along and visit the park. And obviously we're going to reinstate the natural vegetations. Hopefully one day the native animals will be coming back to the space. The space is not all about vegetation, or it's also about people as well. So this graph showing we can have a green open space integrated into the space, which connect the urban space with the green space. So make it active space. So safety is also very important. So you don't want to just have a forest, dense forest, and become unsafe. So the way to keep it safe is by community surveillance. So the more you have more people using the park becomes safer. So to be able to do that, we need higher density neighborhood around our green space. So you can see a lot of sites taken by green space. So you may have a question, where is the house going to go? And also the other thing, we try to compete with the typical detached home. How can we make a high density housing but more attractive and comfortable for people, so people will live in them and will wanting them compared to a typical detached house. So this is an example of 2-bedroom apartments. So we want to make it comfortable and spacious. So you can see you have a spacious kitchen, living area. You have a normal bathroom and extra ensuite. On the outside, you have bigger enough space for the outdoor space, which is very important. So the problem we have now is our house is too big. Units are too small. So if we give them more space for the units, maybe people would love to live in them. So this is just floor plan for 2-bedroom and one bedroom unit. So this is three bedroom unit. So you can see 157 internal square meter rate. So it's quite spacious. So how do we do that? I'm thinking maybe we can look at a modular design, modular construction. So in that way, we can control the finishes, the quality. Also, it's cheaper than typical construction. So maybe for the same price or less, we can have a bigger space. So this is how we typical stack them up to make a unit out of them. This is typical how we do it. But we could do one step. We could do better than that. So by pushing back and forth, we created extra rooftop spaces, which can be used for garden or maybe private open space. And we can also do one step better by stacking them crossways, increase the space on top. So this is a typical floor plan diagram, how it lay out. So you have a car parking and access in the middle, and then apartment on the outside. See, you can stack them, because the modular system, you can stack them whichever ways. So to have the variety. This is sort of typical apartment building layout. So everyone will have their own unique private open space and rooftop spaces. And you have a shop at the front and car parking access behind. On top of that, we can have the solar panels, which will power the entire units and more. And which I'll get back to that at the end of it. This is typical elevations. Blend in with the environment, with the surrounding environment. We can use sort of some timber products which require less maintenance. What I want to show you this section is car parking. So the site is flooded. So to build an underground car parking in the flood area is quite difficult. You're gonna push the water table out and increase the flooding effect on the surface. So it's not only worse for the flooding, will be more expensive. So the solution, maybe we can put car parking behind the units on the ground level. So in that way, this economical is cheaper to build and better for the flooding as well. And also you will increase light and ventilation through the units as well. So back onto the master planning. So remember we have the green space in the middle, and then we can around the outside we can have all the units, the housing around the street frontage. So where this main street, we can have mixed commercial on the ground level and shop top housing above. So I'm gonna zoom into little areas to explain what's in little areas. So this area is surrounded by low density neighborhoods. So over those units can be sort of full stories. And then top part of it. So that's the main street with stadium on the outside. All the activity gonna happen on the track, and we can have the sort of shopping center on the ground level and housing on top of it. So in the middle of it, we try to we're creating this internal active space, which is you can have for all the restaurant, eat straight by the water, and all the activity happening down here, and through the waterways and parks, and will lead people into the museum area, which is the main attraction, become main attraction for the region. This is the view looking from the shop top housing down to this public space. Imagine in this public space, the city can have maybe an art installation competition. We can have art installation throughout, which will attract a lot of people to visit. And we can also imagine that this is a perfect place for a weekend marketplace. All the markets are going to attract a lot of people into the area. This is a view from the ground level. So you're looking at this building behind, it's not very high, so it's about 6 stories. So it's not gonna impact the neighborhood that much. So it's not, could be a really nice place to live in there. So on the other side of the rail track, so at the moment, the neighborhood was divided by the rail track, so you couldn't get across to it. So maybe we could bridge the building over it. It's very similar to a lot of places in Sydney area, maybe Chatswood and other places like that, which foster a connection between all the area of the city. So through here, people can get through, walk up, through here, we can connect all the way to the major Bromido station. So maybe good for commuters and make it easier for people to get around. So now like get to the real stuff. This is the costing analysis. So that we include everything, the parks, the riverways, the museums, and everything. So it's as you can see, is at the moment the construction cost has gone through the roof, so it's very expensive. So question is, how can we make that affordable? So by looking at the development pathway, so on the left is how we do it now. Council rezone the land, hopefully give it to the developer, hopefully for the best, developer will come up with affordable solutions. But the problem is, as soon as you rezone the land, the land value goes to go up as well to fulfill the yield. And how can developer make it profitable? Even though if you give the land to the developer for less than market value, there's no guarantee, there's no incentive for them to pass on the cost. Therefore, we're in this dilemma. So this is on the left is a crazy idea. What if at the moment, even the alien in the outer space know Australia in the housing crisis? So what if we created a national emergency department housing? It's very similar to a public housing system, but it's perhaps gonna better name it. And then you can compulsorily acquire private and crown land, neither crown land. You can't buy everything everywhere, that'd be socialism. But this is just for particular land near the crown land, which you can propose for housing development. And then partner with private sector to build this neighborhood. Because now the government or the public owning the land, you can dictate the better term to the private developer. You can say you can give them a better design guideline, and also ask them for affordable housing, which I'll get into that. So back to our numbers. If we propose a mixed-use shops and housing, we can use the shopping part, the commercial part of it to pay for a lot of stuff. So on top of commercial space, the rent we can get from it can pay for the construction of the commercial space, plus the land cost for the public. And then next section is all the sort of infrastructure obviously can be paid by the public, and the museum, everything can be sort of joint ventures with the private sector. And now we only have the housing construction cost to deal with. So this is a much better number than before. So to break down to each apartment, so I break down to the cost for each type of apartments. So that's the housing cost type. And then back to the terms we're gonna get from the private sector. So this is, we can say to them, well, you can only profit, if you sell them right now, you can profit 20% cap at 20% profits. So this is a selling cost at 20% cost. At the same time, we can also say the future price growth in line with CPI. So we're not only taking care of the current generation, we can also sort of consider the future generation as well. Same with rental, we can cap at 6% rental return. So this is the rent over there. But best of all, icing on the cake is free electricity. So whoever buys and live in there don't have to pay electricity bill. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason. I just think that's why we've got universities, is to help nurture wonderful things, wonderful ideas like this. Thank you so much. That was. I also couldn't help but see the resonances between Aboriginal culture and ancient Chinese Taoist culture in starting with the water and getting those natural pathways just fixed first, because we're fighting with everything. And I actually felt like I was actually excited for this. I mean, we have a lot of historical plans, like subdivision maps in the archives, and people were actually genuinely excited about housing subdivisions once upon a time. And nowadays, the minute someone mentions another housing subdivision, everyone goes, no, we don't want anything like that, because everything turns out to be a horror story. So it would be fantastic if something inspiring that people would actually want built. Okay, over to Dr. Mackenzie.
Thank you. And can I just say thank you to the previous speakers, excellent presentations, big shoes to follow up with. And hopefully I can sort of tie a couple of these things together maybe from your presentations, just in the context of what's happening in Newcastle. And I want to talk, and I'll primarily talk about social housing. Well, what I'll do is I'll talk about social and affordable housing. Of course, these are talked about in the same breath now. It's one of the great sleight of hands of government over the last 20 years is to sort of talk about social housing and affordable housing in the same breath. Quite different. Right? Affordable housing refers to the kinds of rent-controlled community housing provider managed houses that are set aside. Developers get significant concessions to build those on the condition that they're rent controlled for 10 years typically, and then they revert back to normal housing stock. Quite different from social housing, which is government owned and often managed by community housing providers as well, but is retained by government at fixed rates. Quite different again from what we might call actually affordable housing, which is housing that people are able to afford. In Newcastle, none of that is being built, right? Newcastle's in a sort of an unusual zone where we have the same impacts on our housing, construction costs as inner Sydney or Western Sydney, same sort of housing increases in construction index, but for significantly less return on investment, right? So if you are a developer with looking to build, you have the option of building in Sydney or Western Sydney, where the value of your property ultimately will command much higher rates of return, or in Newcastle, which is why we are seeing, in terms of the Newcastle construction, only luxury apartments, right? Newcastle East, Newcastle West, along the high density corridors, we're only seeing luxury apartment blocks being built because that can command more in terms of the return to developers than you can if you're building student accommodation, boarding houses, mixed use, multi studios and so forth. But I want to, before I talk about the private market, and just in the interest of time, I just want to underscore, and this will relate quite strongly to what Professor Root had said earlier, current situation in Newcastle for social housing. There's 1,934 households on the waiting list for social housing and 138 households priority. That means we don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. 138 households priority looking for housing and for social housing. The average wait time in the region for priority is 4 months. So if you find yourself in a position where you are desperately needing social housing, you've got to find a way to meet that need for 4 months. If you're not on the priority list, the average wait time is 30 months, 2.5 years. The projected need currently we have an unmet need for social and affordable housing of about 10,700 units, right? The estimate projected needs by 2036 puts us up around 14,600 in terms of social and affordable, and that's not counting the recent population increases with the New South Wales housing targets. But let's say around about 15,000 to be built by 2036. Currently in development or in design, 150. There might be a couple more than that. But as far as I know, from development application currently being constructed, there's 150 social and affordable houses being built. It's nowhere near. It's a paltry figure in terms of what's been anticipated by the need, which is again around about 15,000. Despite so there's been some generous moves. The New South Wales government obviously has made this a priority. They've given us some numbers, some targets. Oh, you better deliver this target. No infrastructure support, of course, no assistance in the way in which that might be delivered, but plenty of concessions to developers. So if you build affordable housing, that's the official affordable housing, you can get up to a 30% increase on your floor space and height of your building without needing separate approval for that. So very generous development concessions. For every 10 units that you build, you get another 3 on top of that windfall benefit from the rezoning that you were talking about, Jason. You would expect maybe that's produced a flood of social housing, government provided housing would be in places where people wanted to live. You know? So there's some near beaches. We've got some at Bar Beach, Hamilton South. Nice sort of parts of the areas. Now those places have increased in value, so they're being looked at being sold off. And the idea is, well, we'll sell those ones off, but we'll build Western suburbs ones. Get much more bang for our buck if we build them out there. Places with no amenity. Car dependent. They're hotter in summer and colder in winter, so they cost more of your budget to actually live in. And just that level of entrapment in a poverty cycle that comes when you move social housing away from the provisions and services and amenities. In terms of the redevelopment, though, and this goes right to what Professor Root was saying earlier, that when a lot of the housing stock, social housing stock, was built in the 1950s, and it was built for a different target. At the time when that housing stock was being developed, the majority of people that were buying were having access to that social housing. Wages was their predominant income. Right? The number of people who are waged and in social housing has fallen in that period to 7%. 93% of people in social housing are dependent on aged income, disability income, some combination of the two, or some other kind of government-supported income. Historically, it was there to provide a low-cost housing option for families to make that transition into home ownership. But the people who are there now are very unlikely to be making that transition. 70% in the 1970s, as recently as the 1970s, 70% of tenants were couples with children. Now that accounts for 4%. The people in social housing are much older. They're much less likely to be working or have a separate income, and they are much more likely to be living on their own. Some more figures that are interesting here. In 2001, half of the entrants into social housing had complex and intersecting needs around mental health, education support, employment support. That's up to 2/3 just in the last 20 years alone. And as was mentioned, social housing now is partially provided as one of a suite of social welfare provisions. So it's more likely to be bundled with wraparound services for the people in our society that are most vulnerable. Not to do with housing, it is to do with making sure there's a safety net for people who are otherwise not being catered to. 60% of tenants in social housing now live alone. I'll get to that in a moment. 30% are on the aged pension, 34% on the disability pension. In the 1970s, 1 in 3 of social housing, right now 1 in 3 are over 65 and 10% are over 80. The problem that we have is that the housing stock that currently exists in places like Newcastle was designed for families making that transition. So we've got an enormous quantity of 3 and 4 bedrooms, large yards, located sort of in, not necessarily located close in. And now we have underutilisation right across the board where people are looking for studios or 1 bedrooms, now in a situation where they've got enormous maintenance responsibilities, high levels of disability, high levels of need, often quite a bit older. What exists as our housing stock doesn't meet the change demand of what we're actually targeting. And remember, we're just targeting those priorities. One more factor might be interesting to note is that roughly half of the social housing tenants that exist in New South Wales have been in social housing for 10 years or more. So not only are we not making that pathway to transition into home ownership, which is what it was historically intended to do, that low turnover rate means that even though there's more demand, we're not creating more opportunities for them. So it's this compounding set of complications on top of our social housing issues. this is quite sort of separate from ultimately the where we are in terms of the planning. And I probably will talk about this maybe if we leave some time for questions, but the attempt to address this has been to radically sort of alter the planning policy context through some very key measures. One is to sort of create these housing targets from the state government, which are often done, you know, to be blunt about it, it's often done by Sussex Street planners, you know, Macquarie Street planners that sort of do compasses on maps and say this area will increase its density by X, you know, with very limited understanding. The train station example is the perfect one that shows just what has happened there. And the other is to not be providing that enabling infrastructure that makes it possible. So if you have these high housing targets, that's fine. But when people move into areas, if you're not providing new schools, new hospitals, new aged care facilities, new shopping districts, new employment lands, new police stations, new libraries, no community centres, parks, playgrounds, you know, all open space, this is the kind of natural infrastructure that we're sort of barely clinging onto as we go, as we build onto our floodplains. You know, this idea that if we build it, you know, we just create a housing target and shoot for it, then all of these other things will naturally come into place. And there's no evidence historically that is what happens, particularly in an area like Newcastle with very limited greenfield development opportunities. Almost all of our new development is going to be infill or brownfield development, like, you know, Honeysuckle and Broadmeadow from the state perspective. There's a tiny bit, about 7% of our housing target will come in far western suburbs, but we're not expecting anything there other than, you know, when you said before that when people say housing estate and people cringe, if that's what we're expecting in western suburbs, you know, car-dependent cul-de-sacs and you know, even widening, you know, the Minmai Road even further to try and accommodate it. So we've got this sort of quandary of issues, immediate pressing need, and the way that it's predominantly being responded to is to relax the planning controls. You know, I always think, you know, when you're in an emergency, you trust the plans that you did when you weren't in an emergency, right? You don't suddenly take that time to change the plans. And so the you know, the sudden increase to anywhere within 200 metres of a train station to 6 stories, it's worth having a look around the Newcastle train stations to see what the impact that would have on density and needs in those areas, or to create housing targets that are unrealistic and not matched to the provision of social infrastructure is going to create enormous pressure on councils, on state governments, on the ability of communities to manage that massive increase in population without the same level of infrastructure spend on the same community. So I might just sort of, you know, I don't have a solution, I'm just sort of throwing out some issues.
Thank you very much. I've learned something brilliant from each of the speakers, and my brain is very excited. Anyone want to say something? You said something before. What did you say?
I just think with the state government is saying, you know, let's build new railway stations. But what is the point if the railway station is not working half the time? And where are people going to go to? Do they know where people need to go? To Newcastle. Even the buses don't do it because they don't get from A to B.
Yeah.
You can't just start building and then hope for people will fit.
Yeah, we've got a problem here. And what each of these speakers has taught me is that we've got to put our brain into gear and not just say, oh, well, we need to build more houses. Because as far as I'm concerned, you know, the people with money are going to buy them. You know, that's not going to solve people into houses. I mean, it's like we're trying to, you know, someone in Sydney's just decided to, as you said, put a protractor around. So we're just going to build them around train stations. Fixed. But just send it out there and let everyone.
What works in Sydney does not work here.
No, but I don't think it works in Sydney either.
Can I respond to that directly?
Yeah, sure.
Is that all right? So that's exactly right. So the train system in Newcastle works very different. Literally no one gets on a train at Adamstown and goes, I'm going to go into town on the train.
It doesn't stop.
Well, that's right. You know, so it functions in a completely different way. There's a lot of issues with this. One, like Katara is another classic issue, right? On a map, Katara, we'll increase the density around Katara. Katara train station is a 25-minute walk to the shopping centre, right? You know, if you look there, it's all low density. It's all up on a hill. There's no demand for increased density around there. Where there is an increase, and building new train stations is a good idea as a general principle, right? Where we need it is Sandgate and Warrigal, which really need that going. But because it was a Sydney-based plan, they said, oh no, not those train stations because they're diesel trains. So what's that got to do with anything? And we're only looking at rebuilding around electric trains. So the places where we actually could have done with the rezoning, actually push development, has just been arbitrarily left off because there was no understanding of what was actually happening in Newcastle. Much less the fact that they sort of created this rule that would apply to Wickham interchange, which would have actually reduced the amount of yield that we have been able to create through 20 years of careful redevelopment in and around Wickham. So there's just no consideration at all of what is on the ground. Quite literally an arbitrary decision, which has resulted in windfall benefits for people that own the houses in those locations, but very limited capacity for that to actually.
But where do you go?
Where do you go? How do you, what will attract people to move to these, 6-story, 7-story apartments in Katara? Like there's nothing there. It's just a classic case of arbitrary planning.
Well, there is people do like to live in apartments these days. We don't just need houses, and you may not want to move into an apartment, but a lot of people do. And I believe an apartment that was advertised for retirees near Wickham was filled in a flash. With people wanting to get in. I'm just throwing that out. You can't just assume that people don't want to go into apartments. And the other thing I just want to raise, which was mentioned briefly, is the problem of who's going to build or whatever we decide on accommodation, whenever we decide where it's going to be, who is going to build it? How many builders have we got? How's the training going to build things? So just throwing those things.
Yeah, well, as Joe said at the beginning, we've just this has been a problem which is no one's done anything about. Training used to be the hidden art, I've always imagined family being like some kind of godly. At that point, they would be content, sitting on the back porch having a schnapps, looking at their society of happy people just being able to do everything they needed. And that was their recompense. But now that we're in chaos, the hand of the planner is no longer there. I mean, yes.
Kerry's got her hand up too, so I think she's got a question.
Can you hear us, Kerry?
Hi, yeah, I'm here. How are you? I've got a couple of comments on that. So like affordable housing, and this is from me personally, by the way. So I have a 19-year-old third-year apprentice daughter. Now, for her to buy a house, she's allowed to have a 5% deposit, but that's still at a $500,000 house, which basically, you're not going to get much for under that because I've looked for her. She needs $20,000. So, where is a third-year apprentice or a fourth-year apprentice going to get $20,000 from? So for my thing, affordable housing is like if you're on an average wage in Newcastle, you should be able to afford to buy a dwelling. And for some reason, that doesn't seem to be affordable housing. And the other thing is, have we not learnt what happens when you build a Windale? And when you build a social housing suburb, like there's one in every town. We have one in my hometown of Tamworth. It's called Coaldale, and it's exactly the same thing. You put people from low socioeconomic backgrounds all in the one suburb, Mount Druitt. Like we can point fingers at all of them. It doesn't work. All you do is create a ghetto. So we don't really want a ghetto. We need to spread it out a little bit more. And as for the trains, well, like I bought a house in Beresfield because I can catch the train to work, and that was a big tick on my list of things to do. But it's not much point being able to catch a train from Beresfield to town if it gets flooded at Sandgate every time there's a high tide and huge amount of rain. So the whole debate about the public transport, and I read about the Katara one, and they're right, but they built the train stations how many years ago? and nothing's grown exactly as they thought it was going to be. And moving a train station is a pretty big thing. Like the new Maitland Hospital, should they put a train station near it? But how much money is that to just build an extra train station? Like it's such a complex thing. But, I have one daughter who's going to move back to the Hunter Valley and she's not even sure they can afford to buy a house. And then I've got the second one who's an apprentice and, she's still living at home because she can't afford to move out yet. But it's a huge issue. That was my comments.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. Has anyone seen Rouse Hill Railway Station? In Sydney, Rouse Hill Railway Station. Rouse Hill Railway Station actually is elevated, and it's a bit like the Anzac Bridge, where actually the railway goes over the roadway.
Mm-hmm.
But there's housing there. There's a lot of little townhouses. There's a whole suburb of townhouses. So there's a population that will feed the railway, and we just don't seem well. They want to put the population near the railway, but the railway has to go somewhere that's useful.
Well, I just see railways as part of the infrastructure, the nervous system of the city. So, I mean, look, my limit is when I hear proposals like Jason, we see this every year with the architecture students and the studio work. They tackle these problems and they come out with these holistic plans that I'm not getting out of government at all. I'm not getting out of the people that we're actually paying our taxes for. And I see brilliant solutions, brilliant ideas that approach these problems without any of that sort of political, ideological stuff that just makes sense to me, fixing up the flooding issue. Because with all they say we shouldn't be building on a floodplain, but we've got pictures of the archives of Broadmeadow underwater. I mean, the whole Premier Hotel is a lake. The whole thing is a floodplain. But we fool ourselves, and this is where the Aboriginal landscape comes in. We fool ourselves into thinking that because we've put roads and bitumen, somehow we've protected ourselves, or a football oval. Now, our football ovals are on Aboriginal wetlands. Okay, so when we have a Pasha-Bulga flood, the landscape goes back to being an Aboriginal landscape, and we've got no understanding and no care for that. So resonating with what Jason was talking about, that sort of fixing up, that sort of allowing the water to do what it has to do, okay? The ancient Egyptians had a season just for a flood, inundation, because it said the Nile has to create this in order to give us arable lands which will feed us. But here we see a flood as a war. It's us versus the flood. So everything's at war. So if we can get our planning so that we're not at war with nature, the creatures aren't leaving us in droves, that would be wonderful from the way I'm looking at it. These three speakers to me have really unlocked it for me today, what we need to do. How we're going to do it, I don't know. Any questions from the Zoomers? Just
Okay, I just wanted to make a comment about the lady whose friend got a 5% deposit, which is pretty good going, or her apprentice friend did. Yes, I have a friend that's been trying to get a house for 20 years, close to immigrant. She finally got 20 grand out of COVID yes, they can hear me. She finally got 20 grand out of COVID by taking out 10,000 twice from a super, and then it took her another year and a half, and she finally got on the 5% list. So she's actually living in a house after all that time. That, of course, has mixed blessings because in the first few years of home ownership you're struggling, but she's learning.
Okay. But it's when we're talking about those solutions that Jason was saying, if we are going to build in a floodplain, then we've got to design houses that can float.
Volume's terrible.
Or come up with pretty, interesting solutions to meet what is ahead of us, all right? Because there are a number of things hitting us besides the sort of stupid ages that are just coming at it. But, I mean, those wonderful solutions, those holistic ways of approaching things, I just find very inspiring, And while Jason was speaking, I actually want to see something like that created. That would be something, the housing development, I would look forward to, because you could prove, and if you can keep Shane and Paul happy, I mean, these are the guys who have been so concerned with the heritage of the site. And this is what was coming through with the various heritage groups. We've had environmental heritage groups that were looking at the clear felling of their forests or the one up at Maitland, which was, what was that? And that was no, the waterworks, Walker. You know,
Walker Waterworks.
luckily that was called off, but that was another thing. Everything was kind of under siege with this. Like, we've got to solve this housing problem, which means we're going to plonk houses everywhere with no thought and no planning. Into the final.
During the briefing times that they put the briefs together for the students, there's one thing that happened all across this. They pushed back on those briefs, completely pushed back on them and said, this is not Sydney, this is Newcastle, and we need solutions for Newcastle. It's been absolutely mind-blowing. Some of the, Jason's only one over that have come up with solutions for flooding, contamination. They've come up with solutions for the entire city. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to get into government to actually listen to us to what we're doing. We are such a different space and a different place to wherever Sydney will ever be. As John pointed out with the transport and that, we're such a different transport demographic.
Can you explain your goal in all of this?
We have this actually come out of working with Dr. Bernie Curran. So Bernie had approached the university at the time before he passed away that we were going to do this forum, this area, and we were going to work with the students at the architecture department on coming up with solutions for Broadmeadow. It took 8 months from Bernie's passing for me to get everyone he had spoken to bring this together where we are today with John and Anne. We would never have got to this point where we're actually presenting this now. So we've been mentoring, if you like, just with the students and the architecture department. The 25 years of study that I've done on the site, that I had done on the site, and actually being on the site up until 2017, seeing the flooding issues, seeing the contamination issues that were on the site, gave us a great insight to pass on to students. So they have picked up all of that and come up with all solutions. So once you've got that sort of solution, then we worked with the Newcastle Museum to come up with the roundhouses being a museum space, the heritage buildings being reused. Then as we progressed, it became very evident that we had to keep green space in the middle. And this was students that kept coming up and saying, do we keep the green space? What do you think? So we all come, yes, we need this green space because of the amount of flooding. So when you see things like what Jason's done, you've actually got a complete solution of mitigation of that problem. I don't say it's perfect, it never will be, but it also included the environmental, and it also included the energy, what energy would be needed for the site, and how we could actually bring that carbon footprint right down.
But is anyone in power listening?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know. Look, see,
We
part
don't
of it's
know.
just letting us know about it. You know,
Sonia Hornery did zoom in.
Yeah, Sonia, Paul and I have spoken to Sonia.
Yeah.
We'd also spoken to John some 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Carol Duncan came to a meeting with Bernie and us, and she actually talked about it.
Yeah.
And then the other day, Paul and I were invited to have a private interaction with the planning people before the main event. So are we being listened to? I don't know. We're now waiting for an invite for Tahu, who actually own the land, to actually talk to us about where this goes. The only way it's ever going to change is the Newcastle community needs to be able to see what we've seen today and actually take it to them and say, is this what you want?
Better. We want something better.
Want something better, because otherwise we're going to end up with Everleigh and Carriage Works in Sydney here. We're going to have a big space with nothing in it, and we would like this space to tell Newcastle and the Hunter region story, and that's why we work with the museum and come up with the library and facilities.
Fantastic. And on that note, have we got any? We could go on talking for this, but I'd love to just thank our three presenters. Thank you very much, Joe, Jason, and John. Look, we'll make sure whatever announcement we've got to put on the
Hunter Living History site and join it, yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining in on this, and we'll try and make this recording available as soon as possible, because I think it's made me think. It's clarified a lot of terminology that we see bandied around. So just thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, Joe, for giving us the historical where the wheels fell off and where they need to get back on, because we can't do anything without history. Thank you, John, for letting us just bringing all that sort of real world statistics in. I think, look, these two, our future, are really in our history, and we can make people actually excited about these plans by actually coming up with really wonderful solutions that we want to see built. Then there's a bit more hope in the world. Which Ollie needs.
Totally years.
Yeah. And we're going to demand it. You've got to say, look, stop giving us third-rate plans. And this is what they love dumping on us, historically. So just
There's one question. This information was 14 today. Is that going to go on the university website?
yes.
Because that, and then tell people about it. And if we can all say, you know, and have a look, some of the younger people will start to look. And they might start to ask questions at the right place.
And on that note, we'll end. And we'll see you next month for another history showcase on something which we'll decide what it's going to be about. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you later.